A pleasure to have the opportunity to do a little learning with you this evening. Special class tonight. A character that I have always found quite fascinating, and I always root for underdogs. And the character that I want to discuss with you tonight is something of a historical underdog, in as much as no one's really ever heard of him. We've all heard of his commentary, which we're going to come to in a minute, called the Siftei Chachamim, if you prefer the Ashkenazic pronunciation. You pick up any version of a standard Chumash with Rashi, and that's what you'll get, is Rashi and the Siftei Chachamim. Maybe you have Unkelis on the side, but no one else makes it into the standard edition of the Chumash with Rashi, right? They didn't add the Ramban, they didn't add the Ibn Ezra, but Siftei Chachamim, who we never heard of, right? He makes it into the Chumash. So I'm going to say his name. His name is Rabbi Shabtai Bass, and you still never heard of him, right? It's not like, oh yeah, remember learning about. We never learned about him. We never heard of him. We never learned about him, and it's a question mark to me. I don't know why that is. He's actually quite important, and I want to study his life, his works, and his commentary with you tonight. So really 3 sections. I want to look at his biography, a fascinating story. Then I want to focus on the Siftei Chachamim to give you a flavor for what he does on the Chumash. And then I want to zoom in specifically to his commentary on Megillat Ruth. Okay, so who is this man, the author of the Siftei Chachamim, Rabbi Shabtai Bass? So Rabbi Shabtai Bass is an 17th, 18th century figure. He's born in a Polish city called Kalisz in 1641. You know, anybody named Shabtai, so you got to wonder if they're born after 1666, that makes them a little suspicious, because presumably they were from a family of followers of Shabtai Tzvi. If you're born before 1666, so you could innocently be named Shabtai. Lahavdil, you see certain names on the memorial board. So we don't have those names anymore. We don't call our kids those names anymore. But people born before 1933, so they might have had that. They might have had that name. Shabtai Bass is born in Kalisz in 1641. There's a massacre in Kalisz in 1655, and in 1655, Shabtai's parents are murdered, and he and his brother escape. We all know 1648, 1649, the Chmelnytsky massacres, one of the greatest tragedies in the history of the early modern period, as far as Jewish history is concerned, maybe the single greatest, as far as the number of Jews who were murdered. So the Cossacks, live in ignominy. We think, it was probably the Cossacks who perpetrated not just 1648, 1649. There was always a massacre. There was always a pogrom. 1655, we think it was the Cossacks. There's some new history. Maybe it wasn't the Cossacks. Either way, Jews of Kalisz were decimated, and there's a few survivors. Shabtai and his brother survive. 1655, they escape, and Shabtai makes it to the city of Prague. Last week I said, you were all in the Alshich shul, so you're also all in Shabtai Bass's shul. He wasn't the rabbi of the shul, but in the 1650s, 1660s, he was recruited to sing in the choir of the Altanoi shul in Prague. Okay, everyone's been to the Altanoi shul in Prague, so hence the name. Right? He called himself, or he was referred to as a mishorer, as a singer. Bass is the translation of meshorer, or maybe we'd say bass, depending on the pronunciation. But that's the origin of his name, and that's how he sort of made ends meet as a refugee in Prague in the 1650s and 1660s. Okay. So after this time, he's wandering, and he finally makes it as far as Amsterdam in 1679. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Amsterdam is the world capital of of printing and publishing, and it's the world capital of printing and publishing in the Jewish world as well. No one can compete with the quality and volume of the Amsterdam presses. Okay, so Shabtai learns the trade of printing and publishing, and he starts to publish the works of other people, and he starts to publish a number of his own works as well. Okay. In his lifetime, he publishes 3 works, and I'm going to talk about them in a minute. The first is called Sifsei Yeshenim. I'll circle back to it. The second is Sifsei Chachamim, which is the main topic for our class tonight. And finally, just a work that I'll mention in passing called Masechet Derech Eretz, which was a very unusual book in that it had really nothing to do with Judaism. It was a treatise on the roads of Amsterdam. It was written in Yiddish, but it was like a traveler's guide for people who, before MapQuest and Waze, there was Meseches Derech Eretz by Shabtai Bass. Okay, so we'll circle back to his 2 important books in a minute, but just to round out the rest of his life, he basically settles back in Poland, in Breslau, and then a kind of a suburb of Breslau called Dyrenforth. And he opens really what at that time was the only functioning Jewish publishing house in Poland. Okay? And he publishes dozens and dozens of work with an eye on Polish Jewry. Right? Polish Jewry is a huge population of Ashkenazic Jews living in Poland, and there's no printing house in the whole place. Right. And so they have to import books, which is possible. They're importing them from, wherever there's a printing press. Amsterdam is a popular one, as I mentioned. But to cater to that population, he begins printing books, and he prints many of the works that we know, either first time it's printed or the second time. So the Magen Avram and the Taz, and important Polish rabbinic commentaries. So he prints them as a full-time publisher, right? So many of the other commentaries that we've looked at in the past, they're professional rabbis and the thinkers and the philosophers, and Shabtai Bass is a publisher. Okay? He's a printer. That is his full-time. Occupation. He actually has a run-in with the law. He's constantly in trouble with the Jesuits, who are always trying to censor and to stop what they consider to be the propagation of blasphemy. Hebrew texts have a way among the Jesuits of being contrary to Orthodox Christian belief for obvious reasons. So at some point he's imprisoned, and it's a tough go for him. He has these run-ins with the Jesuits. He brings in his family into the printing business, and they continue printing even after he makes his way into retirement. And he finally passes away in 1718. So let me circle back now to the 2 books that I mentioned. The first is a book we've not heard of. It's called the Siftei Yeshenim. The Siftei Yeshenim is monumental and extraordinary. It was the first Jewish bibliography in the history of the universe. No one else had ever done what he did, and he did it in just an extraordinary way. He cataloged. You get ready for this number? You want to guess how many Jewish books were circulating? Obviously, he didn't catch every single one, but the vast majority of them he recorded and cataloged. How many books were circulating, that had been published by 1680? 200 years into Jewish publishing. Anyone want to venture a guess? So he manages to record and catalog 2,200 books. Okay, and it's a totally accessible catalog. So you could look up, these are the printings of the, Magen Avram, and it's printed in this year, in this place, by this publisher. And he's doing this without Google. He visits libraries. He writes to publishers. He gathers all of this information over the course of his travels and the course of his wanderings, and he publishes this extraordinary treatise. I actually have not found this, but in one academic article about this book, at least in one volume of the Sifsei Yeshenim, this is the brilliance of the publisher, he left blank pages so that if you bought the book, you could continue to add, right? He knew 1680 was not the end of Jewish publishing, it was just a point in time. So it could be an updated catalog, right, with you, the purchaser, where you had room to add titles and content as you went along. Yeah, I've not seen that, but I did pick that up somewhere. But an amazing and masterful work of research, bibliography, and categorization. And it's not, it took hundreds of years to match that kind of work. He updated it toward the end of his life. He didn't make it to republishing it. I think it was eventually republished, a second edition, some years later. Okay. So now let's turn to the focus of our evening, which is the Sifsei Chachamim. Okay, so why do you keep calling this book Sifsei Yeshenim, Sifsei Chachamim? So it's just a play on words, because the second letter, if you replace the pei and the beis, which actually look very much alike, so Shabtai, Siftei, it's almost the same. It's almost the same word. So it's kind of a play on his name. So I'm happy to do a little show and tell tonight. I once found a bargain online for this is not the first edition, but it's the second edition of the Sifsei Yeshenim. He reprinted it. It was first printed in 1680, and then he reprinted it in 1712 in Frankfurt. So I'm sorry that we're not in person. Otherwise, I'd be happy to pass this around and show you the book. There's something you miss when you don't get to actually hold the book, like how big was it and what did the paper feel like? And particularly in the case of someone who's a professional publisher, right? It's fascinating to see like what was the quality of his work. And I'll show you an excerpt from the title page of this book in 1712. And again, he's doing his best. Everyone just wants to impersonate what they're doing in Amsterdam. Sometimes in the 18th century, in other presses, on the title page, you'll see something that says something like, printed with like Amsterdam letters, and it says Amsterdam in big letters, because everyone knows that that's the gold standard. And I'm saying this is a knockoff, but like this is my best attempt at a knockoff. At least I was using a good model for my edition. Okay, so the Sifsei Chachamim. Let's take a look at his introduction. You have it in source number 1, and again, I'll just add the source sheet to the chat in case you didn't see it when I first posted it. So in source number 1, it's a little small, but obviously it's online, so you could just enlarge it. This is the title page, or the introductory page to his work. Okay, and he says what his interests are and what his goals are. It's a commentary to Rashi, but there's nothing original, or very little original about his commentary. It's an anthology, and he says what he did is he took 15 books and he names them all. Some of them are known to us. One of them is Mizrahi, who we actually studied a couple months back. He took 15 commentaries. They're what are called today in academic circles super commentaries to a commentary. These were books written about Rashi's commentary to the Torah. So he's a bibliophile, and he's got access to these books, and he loves the books, and he knows where they are, and he finds them. And he says, I'm going to take them, I'm going to create this anthology, and it's going to be a greatest hits of commentaries to Rashi to help you, the reader, understand what Rashi is getting at. And he names them. And he's very generous with his attribution. He says, anytime I cite one of these works, I will tell you the work that I'm citing. And here are the Roshei Tevos. Here's the acronym, right? So if it's Mizrahi, I'm going to tell you, it's going to say Reish Aleph Mem for Rebbe Eliyahu Mizrahi. And if it's the Seder Laderech, I'm going to tell you Tzadi, Dalid, Lamed. 15 books, and I'm going to give credit in each case. Ironically, I don't know if it's ironic, I think it's just sad. In most editions of the Sifsei Chachamim, where you find the Rashi with a little Sifsei Chachamim, just pull out any Chumash on your shelf, you'll find one. So they knocked out, like most of the editions, they knocked out the attribution. So, the Sifsei Chachamim was doing his best to give credit where credit was due. And now, in the 21st century, we're so far ahead of ourselves that we stopped giving anyone attribution. Okay, so I just pulled out 2 lines. Interestingly, by the way, I'll just mention that the Sifsei Chachamim is only partially digitized. You can find most of it online, most of his commentary to the Torah. Not this introduction. No one has digitized, to my knowledge, his introduction. And no one has digitized, again, to my knowledge, his commentary to Megillat Ruth, for reasons that are unknown to me. Okay, but we have them. We have the text. I have the text right here. Okay, so I'm not making it up. From the introduction, just 2 lines, okay? And half the work is reading, just understanding what the words say. This is 18th century. This was printed in 1712. Faithfully reproduced. This is a pretty high quality reproduction, and even so, difficult to read the words. Kol kavanasi lo haya ki im. This is the middle paragraph on source 1. Kol kavanasi lo haya ki im. Rashi. Okay, my whole intention here is just to include what's necessary to understand Rashi. But kol makom shamizrachi ubal nachalas Yaakov ve'acherim halchu begdulos uveniflaos bebekiusam bekushyasam ubepulim mihashas kimo beparshas mishpatim ubeshar mekomos lo hichnasti roshi ben harim gedolim. He says, but I'm not getting into the other stuff. You have these great minds, these brilliant commentators, and they have these questions and answers and hermeneutics and casuistry, and they're doing all kinds of Talmudic gymnastics to understand. So I'm not interested. I want the bottom line. If they start going off on one of, I don't get involved. Okay? I've just extracted for you the highlights from their commentaries, which are relevant to understanding Rashi on the most straightforward level. V'kasafti rak mashahu kipshuto lehavanas Rashi zal. My whole goal is to record what is in the service of understanding pshat in Rashi. And we'll see too, whether and to what extent he delivers on this promise. But what a contribution! Anybody could sit around and write a commentary. Like, I think it means this, I think it means that, and not to diminish anyone's commentary. But he did the homework, right? He pulled out, right, 15 dense, thick tomes, commentaries on Rashi, which are all, written with deep immersion in not just the text of the Torah, but in all the midrashim and Talmudic sources that Rashi calls upon. So obviously, this man Shabtai Bass has mastery over all of them, and he tells you, right? He makes the executive decision what I'm going to cite to help explain Rashi. So what a service, right? And now it's no wonder why, every edition of the Chumash and Rashi that we've ever seen has his, it's like, it's the greatest hits of commentaries to Rashi. It's indispensable. How could you live without it? And what a contribution, what a service to every person who's tried to learn Rashi since he published this in 1680. Okay. Let me pause here and just ask if there are any questions or comments about the kind of, background, life, and work of Shabtai Bass.
Rabbi, could you tell us something about his own education? How did he become so brilliant?
So we don't know that much about his education. We think that he was homeschooled in Poland, and then he apparently did pursued some education while in Prague. But I don't think he ever said, my Rebbe was, or where I learned. I don't think that's really known to us. So, like many of the figures that we've seen, my impression is a lot of it is autodidactic.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Yes, did you have a question?
I just don't quite understand why Rashi, which is the ultimate commentary on the Chumash, why it needs so much explanation. Why do we need a commentary on a commentary?
Okay, perfect.
Does that mean that the original commentary wasn't good if it wasn't clear enough?
No, so perfect segue. If I haven't answered your question, in the next 15 minutes, so ask me again. But tell me if you get at least a portion of the answer by seeing him in action. Okay. So again, to see him in action requires multiple steps. So you need to know the text of the Chumash. You need to know what Rashi's doing in interpreting that particular text, and then you can jump into the comment of the Sifsei Chachamim. Okay, so these are chosen almost at random, but I wanted to give you a flavor for how he functions, and really to answer Yassi's excellent question. So I tried to pick either examples that are known or easily accessible, that don't require 20 minutes of background to jump into them. So here's one from the beginning of Parshas Va'era, and the Torah is giving us the debate between Moshe and Hashem as to whether or not Moshe can actually approach the task that he's been set to. Okay, so just give you the pasuk and the Rashi. Sources 2 and 3. Vayidaber Moshe lifnei Hashem le'imor hein bnei Yisrael lo shamu elai ve'ech yishma'ini paro v'ani aral svasayim. So the pasuk says, Moshe comes back, it's mid-conversation, so you have to forgive me that I've taken it out of context. But Moshe comes back to Hashem and says, I just tried this. I went to Bnei Yisrael. They didn't listen to me, right? And the Torah says, Mikotza ruach v'avadakesh. They couldn't hear his words. He said there's going to be the redemption. They couldn't hear him. So now Moshe comes back and says, I'm a failure, right? If the Jewish people won't listen to me, how will Paro listen to me? And Vani aral svasayim, and I have this speech impediment, whatever its specific meaning is, almost not relevant for this piece. But the two parts of this argument: one is, the Jewish people didn't listen to me, so Paro won't listen to me, and I'm an aral svasayim. So Rashi comments on this line, source number 3. Ve'ech yishma'ini Paro. How will Paro hear me? Ze echad mi'asara kal v'chomer shebatorah. So Rashi says this is one of 10 kal v'chomers in the Torah. Kal v'chomer, hard to translate into English. Usually we use the Latin a fortiori, right? If the hill is so steep that the car can't make it up the hill, how will the bike make it up the hill? So what's the kal v'chomer? What's the kal v'chomer, right? So I don't understand. It should have nothing to do with each other. The Jewish people aren't listening to me. The pasuk said, they couldn't hear my words because they're so beaten down that they're not capable of hearing a message of hope and redemption. Paro is not going to hear my words because I'm not a capable spokesperson, and I don't have the right language, or I don't have the right diction, or whatever he means. What's the kal v'chomer? Well, it's just two separate issues. It's not comparative. They have nothing to do with each other. So that's the unasked question that the Sifsei Chachamim jumps into answer. And again, the answer might be compelling or it might not. But 9 times out of 10, the Sifsei Chachamim is attempting to answer the unanswered question, the unasked question in Rashi. Okay, so I just bolded it for you at the end of source number 4. Sifsei Chachamim says, and again, he's just citing another source. The kal v'chomer hu hachi. Let me explain to you what the kal v'chomer is. Meaning, how would you know from just reading this Rashi? Right? It's not jumping out at us. He says, I'll fill it in for you. Ma Yisrael sheshemua tova hi lahem v'aya lahem lekabel divarai v'afilu hachi lo shamuli. Paro sheshmua rahi lo kol shekain shelo yishma'eni. So he says it's about the receptivity. The kal v'chomer goes like this. He says the Jewish people should have been so desirous of hearing this great news about the redemption. That's considered good news. People love hearing good news. Even the people who hear good news won't listen to me. For Paro, right, it's the opposite. I'm telling him he's got to release his slaves, and if not, then he's going to have to, bear the burden of plagues that come and punish him and his nation. Certainly, he's not going to listen to me. No one likes to hear bad news. Okay. So at least now, right, there's some context and there's some substance. You can put some meat on the bone. What was the Kal V'chomer Rashi's talking? Well, now I know, right? The Sifsei Chachamim lays it out for us. Jump with me, if you will, to sources 5, 6, and 7. This is one of my favorite examples, one of my favorite comments of the Sifsei Chachamim in all of the Torah. Not like I know every one, but among the ones I know, this is one of my favorites. Okay, and again, Yossi, you'll see to answer your question, right? To why you need a comment on Rashi. So this is a great example. Okay, in source number 5. So this is a halacha. The Torah tells us, Lo sesaev adomi ki achichahu, lo sesaev mitzri ki ger ha'isa bi'artza. Okay, so how do you relate to foreign peoples? So the Torah has different categorizations and different classifications. This is how you relate to Amalek, and this is how you relate to Ammon and Moab, right? We'll come to in the Megillah. So what about Edom and what about Mitzrayim? So the funny formulation in the Torah, Lo sisa'ev adomi, okay, don't abuse the Edomite, ki achichahu, right? Because Edom, it's Yaakov and Esav, they're brothers, so they're cousins. So, they might be enemies, but don't have, too much of an abusive relationship with them, because at the end of the day, they're family. Point number 1. Lo sisa'ev mitzri ki ger ha'isa bi'artza. Okay, and this we get in different formulations a number of times in the Torah, but meaning the same halacha, lo teta'ev, don't oppress, don't abuse the Egyptian for a different reason, because you were a ger in his land. At the end of the day, he offered you hospitality at a time when you had no place else to go. So the simple explanation of that pasuk. So we don't abuse, we don't oppress the Egyptian. You don't need a comment. The pasuk makes sense. Rashi comments. Look what he says. Just compare the 2 lines in Rashi. Lo sisa'ev adomi, legamre. Don't abuse him. Don't oppress him entirely. V'afal pi shera'i lo, ra'i lecha l'ta'avo sheyatza b'cherev likrascha. He waged war against us unprovoked. There's reason to have a tense relationship with the people of Edom. So the Torah says, okay, meaning you can, but not legamri, not entirely. Point 1. Point number 2, lo tzisa'ev mitzri. What about the Egyptian? Don't oppress him. Mikol v'kol. Don't oppress him entirely. Afal pi shezarku zechorechem liyaor ma tam shayu lachem achsanya b'shasatcha. Okay, they infanticide. They threw our kids into the Nile. No, but he gave you, the Egyptians gave us a place to reside when we had no place else to be. So you have to remember that. So what's the question? The question is, look at the formulation in Rashi. When it came to the Edomite, he said, don't oppress them entirely, legamre. He says the same thing when it comes to the Mitzri, which is you have some kind of middle ground. You owe him something, but there's lots of reasons to dislike him. So legamre or mikol v'kol. 2 synonyms to say what seems to be exactly the same thing. So this should, like a red light should go off. Why did Rashi, who say it's the next line? It's not like 6 years later he had a different pen and it was a different formulation. So it's the next line. He's saying the exact same thing in the exact same context in 2 different formulations. Why? So the Sifsei Chachamim says, I'll tell you why. Benakat kan mikol v'kol. It's a strange way to say it. Legamre is the more obvious way. Mikol v'kol is like idiomatic, but it's less straightforward. Why don't you say just legamre, the same as you said a second ago? Benakat kan mikol v'kol rotzolomer mishum shenemar kol haben hayilud hayaora tashlichuhu v'chol habas techayim. It's brilliant. You see what the Sifsei Chachamim is saying? He's saying, remember the mikol v'kol. It's a pun. It's a play on words. It's not just a play on words. It's a direct citation. The pasuk itself uses a kol and a kol. Kol haben hayalud hayaor tashlichu, the kol habas techayun. All the male children you'll throw into the Nile, and all the female children you'll allow to live. Kol v'kol. Right? It's the exact pasuk that Rashi is citing from. So the Sifsei Chacham is not an accident that Rashi used that formulation. That formulation takes you back to the pasuk that you should be thinking about when you think, oh, should I? What kind of relationship should I have with the Egyptians? Mikol v'kol, kol haben hayod v'kol labas techayun. Right? It all fits so perfectly, and it describes so much intentionality. You think it's just like happenstance, lagamre, mikol v'kol. He just chose those formulations out of thin air, pulled them out of a hat. No, they're not pulled out of a hat. They're pulled out of a pasuk, and the Sifsei Chachamim tells you the pasuk that they're pulled out of. Okay. Let me just give you one more example from Tanakh, and then I want to turn to the Megillah in the time that we have remaining. Okay, this is a classic. Rashi in source pasuk. Let's just look at source 8, so you can understand the Rashi in source number 9. So in Parshas Vayishlach, so Hashem appears to Yaakov as he's heading down. To Padan Aram, and at the end of the scene, the Torah tells us, "Vayal me'alav Elokim b'makom asher diber ito," that like Hashem went back to his place. There was a revelation, and then Hashem ended the revelation. Vayal mi'alav Elokim b'makom asher diber ito. From the place where he was speaking to him, so he ascended, he left. So Rashi says, b'makom asher diber ito, he left that place. Eini yodea ma melamdeinu. Rashi has a comment. He says, I don't know what that means. I don't know what the purpose of this pasuk is, or the purpose of those, right, the second half of that pasuk, b'makom asher diber ito. Don't know. Fascinating that Rashi would inject a comment to say, I don't know. Right? Amazing, the intellectual humility. You could just skip it. He doesn't skip it. He says, no, I'm just telling you, I don't know. So the Sifsei Chachamim, right, and in the interest of time, I'll just summarize it for you. So he says, there's a medrash on the same formulation, Vayal me'alav Elokim. There's this a formulation when Hashem reveals himself to Abraham in Parshas Lech Lecha. There's the same formulation, and there's a medrash on that formulation. Except if you go back and compare our pasuk to the pasuk in Lech Lecha, the words b'makom asher diber ito are entirely superfluous in this pasuk. So Rashi is noting for us, right, that those words are unexplained by the medrash, which explains the first half of the pasuk. The Chama Leibowitz picks up on this theme of the Sifsei Chachamim and adds the following, which I think is quite important. She writes in source number 11, why did Rashi see fit to proclaim to the world his failure to find a plausible explanation of the superfluous text? Surely the admonition of our sages to teach your tongue to say, I do not know, was meant to apply only in response to an inquiry. But no one was called upon gratuitously to proclaim his ignorance. Surely Rashi has left many passages in the Torah unexplained, and he could very well have passed over our text without comment, since he had none to make. But this presents no difficulty. Rashi left those texts unexplained, which were plain to him, that he presumed would be clear to any Torah student. If he had remained silent in our context, he would have been guilty of misrepresentation, allowing scholars to imagine that everything was crystal clear, failing to draw attention to a difficulty in the text. He therefore proclaimed to the world his failure to give adequate explanation, right, of our phrase in the place where he had spoken with him, throwing out a challenge to commentators and scholars to search, probe deeper, and labor in their efforts to find their own solution. So fascinating. Rashi's calling attention to it to say, I don't know what it means, but if you figure it out, by all means, you should comment because the pasuk deserves attention. Okay. Let me transition now, in the time that we have remaining, to the Sifsei Chachamim's commentary to Megillas Rus. And again, we have to do the same extra layer of work. He's not commenting on the Megillah. He's commenting on Rashi's commentary to the Megillah. So it almost presupposes that we've already, kind of mastered not only the text, but Rashi's commentary Rashi's commentary to the text. And I just want to share maybe 2 or 3 highlights from his commentary, again, to give you a sense of the flavor for how much he contributes to our understanding of Rashi, so that we better understand the text. Okay, so I begin with a Rashi, with 2 Rashis. The first from the very beginning of Parshas Vayetze, and the second from the very beginning of, it's not the very first, but right near the beginning of Megillas Rus, and they both say the same thing. Remember, Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva vayelech Harana. It's the very beginning of Parshas Vayetze. So Rashi, Johnny on the spot, jumps in and he says, source number 12, Lo haya lichtov ela vayelech Yaakov Harana. You don't need that whole formulation. Just say Yaakov went to Haran. We know he was in Beersheba. You don't need to the whole geography lesson. Just tell me where he went. The lama hiskir yitziaso. Why do you have to tell me that he left? Okay, so famous formulation from Rashi. Rashi says it's to tell you a very important message, namely, when a tzaddik leaves a particular place, his departure makes an impression. Shebizman she'atzadik ba'ir hu hoda, hu ziva, hu hadara. When a tzaddik lives in a particular location, so he illuminates that place. He endows it with the spark of his holiness. Yatsa misham, as soon as he leaves, pana hoda, pana ziva, pana hadara, everything that he contributed, right, just by virtue of his presence, leaves along with it. And now, that's the part of the Rashi that we know. We then just go to the next Rashi. But Rashi adds, he says, V'chein v'teitze min hamakom ha'amor benom miverus. Right? You have the same thing that happens, v'teitze min hamakom, when Naomi and Rus leave Moab. So they left, and they were also tzidkanios, and they also made an impression when they left. Okay. Now look at the Rashi in the first chapter of the Megillah, source number 13. V'teitze min hamakom. It's going to sound familiar. Lama harei kvar nemar v'teshev mistei Moab. We knew where they were. We knew where they're going. It doesn't have to say v'teitze. Mehechin tashuv im lo teitze. How were they going back if they didn't leave? We know they left. Minakom sh'haisasham. Ela magid. It's to tell you. Shiatzias tzadik minakom nikeres ve'oseh roshem pana ziva, pana hadara, pana shivcha shel ir. The tzaddik leaves, the tzadekes leaves, and leaving with them is every influence that they had on their particular location. V'chein, and by the way, it's the same thing as Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva, same issue and same teaching. So source number 14, and I'll just summarize it. The Sifsei Chachamim says, well, why do you need both? Just give me one teaching, right? And again, using the kind of the basic supposition or the basic assumption of the economy of language of Tanakh, if the goal of the extra word of Vayetze or Vatetze is to teach this lesson, so just teach it to me once, right? The assumption is I'm going to read all of Tanakh. I'll get it when I got to Yaakov. I don't need to get it again when I get to the Megillah. I got it. Or if I got it when I got to the Megillah, why did I need it when it came to Yaakov? Just tell it to me one time. And Rashi, right, keeps cross-referencing. The first one is the second one is the first one. Why both? So the Sifsei Chachamim says, well, there's a difference. Right? Whenever you have a duplication, so the Sifsei Chachamim says you have to decouple them. And imagine if you only had one, what you might have assumed, and if you only had the other, what you might have assumed then. If you only had Yaakov, there's something you might not know. If you only had Yaakov, you might think that the case of the tzaddik is only in a case where let's just see it inside. I'll give you the better formulation. It's better than my summary. He says, "V'kasha dahacha hevi rai mahasam lakan v'hasam gabi Naomi v'rus mevi rai lakan." Right, each one is the cross reference to the Yesh lamar ilo hevi rai mahasam ha'isi omer dil mashtei yitzios amoros kan ba'ala shmina de'echad yitzias gufa be'echad yitzias mamono v'tzono v'kara shiatzo imo. He says you might distinguish between the one who has his resources with him when he leaves and the one who does not. לכן צריך להביא ראיה מהסם שיצאו צדיק עושה רושם כמו שפירשך. דהסם אי אפשר לפרש על יציאת ממונה. Dahasam Amma Varikam Heshibani. When it came to the Megillah, when it came to the characters in Rus, right? So they left with nothing. They were impoverished. Shema mina shelo hayala shum mamon, right? They had no wealth. So you might have thought that when a tzaddik leaves, but he leaves penniless. So maybe that whole concept doesn't apply. Because, right, how much influence can you have if you have no resources to your name? So Kamash Malan, so the Sifsei Chachamim says, so you need the case of not only Naomi and Ruth, but you need the case of Yaakov, right, to tell you that the influence is in either case. And then, so if that's the case, then why not just have Yaakov? So the Sifsei Chachamim goes on to say, you might have thought that the principle only applies. That the principle only applies if you're the last one on the scene. You might have thought that the principle only applies if you are the last tzaddik in the city, but it applies even in the case of Yaakov. Even in the case of Yaakov, where, right, who had he left behind? Who was still living in Beersheba? Yitzchak and Rivka. And even so, his departure makes an impression. Right? So one complements the other, and both teachings are necessary. A tzaddik leaving the city matters even if they have no economic resources. A tzaddik leaving the city matters even if they are not the only one to leave, even if they've left other tzaddikim behind. You need Ruth and Naomi, and you need the case of Yaakov.
Rabbi, wouldn't another important distinction be to teach us that a tzaddik can also be a non-Jew, like Ruth?
Okay. So that's a great thought. Perhaps. And that comes back, I guess, a little to the debate we were talking about over the last couple of weeks as to when she converted and if, in fact, she was a non-Jew at this time. But yeah, that's a great observation.
I don't quite understand what he's commenting on in Rashi. He's explaining why we need to have two separate psukim, but what in Rashi is bothering him. I understand why there's two separate psukim. That's what he's addressing, but he doesn't seem to be addressing any problem in Rashi. Yeah.
So the question, it's very nuanced, but his working assumption is that every word of Rashi is important, which I'm happy to accept that assumption. So the question that he's trying to answer is, why in each case does Rashi reference the other? If it's in fact only the same, if it's just another example of the same exact concept, so who needs to comment on both, right? Just comment on one. But in fact, he comments on both and cross-references the other. So that's what tips off Sifsei Chachamim that requires comment. I'll just say, since you brought it up, it's an important formulation, which is to say, there's also a kind of assumption in the Sifsei Chachamim that something is always bothering Rashi, and very often his contribution is to help us understand what it is. Okay, so I'll give you maybe just one final example, and then we'll call it a night. If you look at sources 17 and 18. Okay. Again, at the end of your source sheet, you have the whole Megillah. I should have mentioned that up front. So in case you wanted to go back and look at the text itself. But at the very end of the first chapter of the Megillah, the author tells us that Naomi comes back to Bethlehem, Vatahom kol ha'ir, and the whole city is like aghast. How do you want to even translate Vatahom? Like they're dumbfounded, they're astonished, they're perplexed. Right, and they say, Hazos Naomi, is that really Naomi, this aristocratic family? She left with everything, she's come back with nothing. They can't believe it. They're beside themselves, vatahom. So Rashi says in source number 17, vatahom kol ha'ir. Nasis homia kol ha'ir kulam niskabtu likvor ishto shel Boaz shemesa bo bayom. So this is an unusual Rashi. And the Sifsei Chachamim is going to take us through kind of each contribution of Rashi. So Nasis homia kol ha'ir. So the entire city was stunned. Kulam niskabtu likvor ishto shel Boaz shemesa bo bayom. They were all gathered to bury the wife of Boaz who had passed away on that very day. So, on one level, it's like a non sequitur. What has one got to do with the other, right? What does their astonishment at seeing Naomi have to do with the fact that Boaz's wife, passed away on that day? Meaning they could both be true, but why are you putting them in the same sentence? So Sifsei Chachamim, source number 18. He says, the kasha l'Rashi eich tehom ha'ir. He says, first of all, what does it even mean for a city to be, dumbfounded? It's a bizarre thing to say. It says, Lachein pirish nasis homia mehomios b'nei adam asher betocha. So, it's like saying the shul was broke. So it's not the shul that's broke, it's the leadership, it's the membership, it's the people being, right? What do you mean, the institution, right? It's a strange formulation. It says the city was dumbfounded. No. The groups in the city, the people in the city, the people who were there, they were dumbfounded. Okay, so that we can understand, and we probably would have figured that out, on our own. It's idiomatic. He's damen lebiaso kol ha'ir. So now the Sifsei Chachamim says Rashi has a different problem, which is how did everybody in the city come to be there? Right? The whole city, if you're taking the text at face value, so many people were astonished. The people who first saw her were astonished. The whole of Beit Lechem, every last resident of Beit Lechem is astonished. What scenario was everyone present to be astonished? Lachein pirshu niskabtu. That's why the Sifsei Chachamim says, he says, no, every resident of the city was actually present because there was a communal tragedy. And when there's a communal tragedy, everyone shows up. What was the tragedy? The wife of the shofet died. The wife of the shofet died. Everyone went to the funeral. So everyone is in fact present on that moment when Naomi returns. Umashi pirush likvor ishto shel Boaz. The kasha l'Rashi v'chol ze lamali. Uma ba hakasav le'odienu b'zeh sheniskabtu ba'osa hayam kol ha'ir. So now the Sifsei Chachamim actually adds another layer of meaning. He says, but who cares? Right? Why does any of this matter in the slightest? Right? If a few people would have been astonished, the whole city is astonished. What's writing on that? Why would that be of any significance to the text? So he says, no, there's another piece of crucial information here. Elabalo dianu shebo bayom mesa ishto shel Boaz ve'ein hatzadik meis ad sheba achar bimkamo. And now he gives you a theological message, right? The Sifsei Chachamim is reading into Rashi a theological message, right? Which Rashi only said on a surface level, but didn't fully explicate. So Sifsei Chachamim says, I'm going to tell you what Rashi was really getting at. And I'm going to prove it to you in a second. He says what Rashi was really getting at is the theological premise that a tzaddik only dies after someone has been prepared to take his or her place. So, there's and again, it's a theological comment, but Hashem has structured his world such that the Jewish people are never left without the requisite leadership. So it's a tragedy that a leader died, but rest assured, there's someone else who's waiting in the wings. So he says, he actually quotes what he thought was Rashi. We think it's the commentary of the Rashbam in source number, I'll show it to you in source number 20. Just look at source number 19. This is the Gemara that the Sifsei Chachamim is using to prove his point. So the Gemara says, "Vatahom kol ha'ir alehem v'tomar na'azos Naomi." The Gemara picks up the pasuk from the Megillah and says, "Ma hazos Naomi." What do they mean by that? They say, "Is that really Naomi?" Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Amar Chazisem. Notice Naomi shiatzam eretz lechutz laaretz ma alsala. Just notice what he started pointing. What happened to her? She left with everything, and she came back with nothing. And then Rabbi Yitzchak said, and this is the key line, "Oso yom shabata rusa movial eretz Yisrael mesa ishto shel Boaz." So we have this Masara, we have this oral tradition that the very same day that that Naomi and Ruth arrive in Israel is the same day that Boaz's wife perishes. Rashbam on the spot, source number 20. With this, we'll conclude. Mesa ishto shel Boaz ulashmeinin asa shekadosh baruch hu maktim rafula maka v'yesh lo adam livtoach be'akadosh baruch. So the Sifsei Chachamim quotes this line, which again he attributed to Rashi. And he inserts this theological comment into Rashi's comment here at the end of the first chapter. Rashi wants you to know that the Jewish community of Bethlehem was burying the wife of Boaz at this moment because he wants you to know that in the grand scheme of things, Hashem has organized his world such that the Jewish people are never without the leadership they need and the leadership they deserve. So one woman dies, another great woman is waiting in the wings. Just at the moment that they're burying her, right? Who arrives in Bethlehem? Ruth HaMoaviyah, the woman who will become the next wife of Boaz and the great grandmother of David HaMelech. So just know, says the Sifsei Chachamim, just know, maktim refuah lamaka, right? And it's timely message, right? We would say in the 21st century, right? The vaccine predates the virus. It was, we had to discover it, we had to produce it, we had to distribute it, but Hashem makes sure that the cure is always present before the malady. And so Rus was approaching just at that moment. The Sifsei Chachamim writes in his introduction that he was fulfilling a promise. He said if he made a promise because there was that pogrom, that massacre, and he said if I'm saved, I'll contribute by writing this book, by writing this commentary to Rashi. He himself was a man of great faith, and peeking through the lattices of his commentary, you can pick up the notions of that same emunah and that same faithfulness in his explication of Rashi, and you see it here in this context. Please God, next week we'll wrap up this series. I'm going to stay on, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, and I wish everyone a good evening.